Reflections on the Good News of Jesus Christ for the second Sunday of Easter. To set the stage, it is the night of Easter. The apostles have heard the rumors about Jesus, but they're not really sure they can believe them. They are afraid for themselves that they might be found and subjected to the same terrible death that Jesus was subjected to. And so they are in hiding. And allow me to continue from the Good News according to John. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the doors were locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained." Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into the nail marks, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now, a week later, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, although the doors were locked, and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believe." Thomas answered and said, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through this belief you may have life in his name. The good news of the Lord. The peace of Christ, sorely needed in a world that knows far too much of dissension, violence, and chaos, as we have been again reminded in these last several weeks. The absence of peace, in its common sense understanding, is most immediately evident in the war and strife that divides and consumes nations, races, ethnic and religious groups, families, generations, and spouses. Any day's headlines tell far too many stories of the absence of peace. And all too often, real peace, once the grand oratory is done with, is dismissed as unrealistic, and resources, wealth, and energy are given over to the tools and strategies of control, violence, destruction, and death. As Pope Leo XIV said on Easter Sunday, "We are growing accustomed to violence, resigning ourselves to it, and becoming indifferent." Less evident, but no less real, is the absence of peace that is intrinsic to the life of grasping, manipulating, plotting, and acquiring, which is so common in our frenetically functional, problem-solving, success-oriented society. Here, too, though there may be no war as such, there is also no peace of mind, certainly no peace of heart. Witness the search by so many people to find ways to cope with the excess stress, tension and agitation afflicting them. If you want to produce a bestseller, write a book on how to reduce stress, but in no more than 7 steps. Witness the road rage, public rudeness, and other indicators of a lack of patience, which is almost always a sign of a lack of peace. Our need for peacemakers, our need to be peacemakers, is tremendous. Peace in all its manifestations, interior, with one another, and with God, is a characteristic of the kingdom Jesus came to inaugurate. A lack of peace, then, is usually a sign that we are trying to do our own will and build up our own kingdom, rather than find and follow what is God's will, and so build up God's kingdom. What is God's will? What does God want me to do? Not just in terms of the overall direction of my life, but even in the comings and goings of this day. Or is that a question I even think to ask myself? Perhaps we have disclosed at least part of the problem. Maybe the issue is that there are areas of life in which we would just as soon not have God meddling. Maybe we divide our lives into areas that are open to God and other areas that are not, setting ourselves up as God's competition. We do just that each time we find an exception to one of the basic messages of the gospel. Love that person? Forgive that person? Renounce revenge? Serve one another, especially the poor? Beware of riches and the attachment to possessions? You've got to be kidding, Jesus. You can't mean that. My brothers and sisters, how easy it is for us to justify exceptions to the core principles of the gospel. But trying to find and follow God's will in all areas of our lives is fundamental to being a follower of Jesus. Just before he went to face his persecutors and executioners, he wrestled with his Father's will, but finally accepted it. And that acceptance gave Jesus the peace that sustained him through everything that followed those hours in the Garden of Gethsemane. He stood before Pilate on trial for his life and filled with a deep sense of peace. Pilate, to all appearances, had all of the power, but none of the peace. As today's gospel tells us, it is the risen Christ who reveals to us the peace of Christ. The climactic third scene of that story takes place 1 week after the resurrection, with Jesus' second appearance to the assembled community, this time with Thomas present. He invites Thomas to examine his wounds and to believe. Christ's blessing in response to Thomas's profession of faith acknowledges the faith of every Christian of every age who believes without seeing. All Christians who embrace the Spirit of the risen Christ possess a faith that is in no way different from or less than that of the first disciples. The power of the resurrection transcends time and place. The peace that Christ gives his new church is not a passive sense of good feeling or the mere absence of conflict. Christ's peace is hard work. The peace of the Easter Christ is to honor one another as sons and daughters of the same Abba. The peace of the Easter Christ seeks to build bridges and find solutions, rather than assign blame or extract punishment. The peace of Christ is centered in relationships that are just, ethical, and moral. The peace that the risen Christ breathes into us at Easter shows us a way out of those tombs in which we bury ourselves, especially the tombs of despair and anger. to live our lives in a spirit of joy and gratitude. The peace of Christ is realized in loving when it is most difficult to love, in putting aside our own doubts and disappointments for the sake of another, in forgiving when we are too angry or disappointed to forgive, in reaching out when we expect to be rebuffed or rejected. The forgiveness Christ breathes into us enables us to get beyond the facades that we create and the rationalizations we devise to justify them. Jesus' entrusting to the disciples the work of forgiveness is what it means to be the church, to accept one another, to affirm one another, to support one another as God has done for us in the risen Christ. What brought the apostles and first Christians together as a community, unity of heart, missionary witness, prayer, reconciliation, and healing, no less powerfully binds us to one another as the church of today. All of us, at one time or another, experience the doubt and skepticism of Thomas. While we have heard the good news of Jesus' empty tomb, all of our fears, problems, and sorrows prevent us from realizing it in our own lives. In raising his beloved Son from the dead, God also raises our spirits to the realization of the totality and limitlessness of God's love for us. From this awareness comes great peace. The risen one's gift of peace is centered in Christ himself. It is the peace that mirrors his selfishness, his compassion, his joy. To borrow from Franciscan friar Father Richard Rohr, when many of us were children, we took part in our parish's religious education program. For 8 years, we learned the prayers and rituals of our church. In high school, we were confirmed. Soon, many of us were off to college, and church may have been put aside as we earned our degree and, after graduation, established our career. Then we married and began a family. And our faith took on a renewed importance as we wanted our children to have the same connection to God that we had. That's the first half of a typical spiritual life when we learned the language and choreography of a religious institution. We learned the words and rituals for articulating our faith. We established a spiritual identity in belonging to a church community. The values and beliefs of faith we learned then became a bridge to instill those same values and beliefs in our children. But then came a crisis in our life, an unexpected illness or death, a divorce, a financial setback, a lost job. After that crisis, we entered the second half of the spiritual life, one in which we hear a deeper voice of God. It's a voice calling us to compassion, forgiveness, risk, surrender. We now hear God not just in the rituals and creeds of our church. We hear God in the deepest part of our heart. Our faith is now fully ours. The Apostle Thomas might be considered the patron saint of this second half of our spiritual lives, when we struggle to make sense of lives that have been turned upside down by crisis or catastrophe. In today's Gospel, Thomas feels that the faith he experienced and embraced in Jesus has been betrayed in Jesus' crucifixion. But in his resurrection, Jesus offers Thomas a reason to hope, a baseline for belief, a prism for looking at the world with gratitude for what has been and what will be. Faith in the second half of our lives is the ability to hope that we can transform and remake, recreate, and refocus our lives in the love of God and the life of the risen Christ. Pope Leo made it clear just days ago to anyone with ears to hear, threats of war and the annihilation of a civilization are the exact opposite of the peace Christ came to bring. As he said, quoting the prophet Isaiah, "Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood." And as the Pope reminded us, in any war, the only side God is on is the side of the suffering. At every worship service, we exchange Christ's peace with one another, an exchange which says that we want to be reconciled and at peace among ourselves, even when that may seem an impossible goal. And so, as we exchange Christ's peace, we are expressing our longing for a greater measure of that peace in our lives, peace the world cannot give. It is in our longing and praying for peace that we find ourselves better able to bring peace and be peace to others. We cannot give what we do not have. But the more we have followed the path of Jesus, the more we will find the gift of peace. Not an absence of all conflict. This is no Fantasyland fairy tale, but a tranquility that remains even in times of tension and conflict. A sure sign that we are living in the peace of Christ. St. John Henry Newman described it this way: "The Christian has a deep, silent, hidden peace which the world does not see, like some well in a retired and shady place, difficult of access. It is the grace of God within. It is the presence of the eternal Comforter, in which the Christian finds joy." May you find that peace and joy. May you bring it to others throughout this Easter season and every day that follows. Thanks for listening. Please feel free to share this reflection with others. And if you would like to receive this gospel reflection every weekend, please do subscribe at our website, www.justanother.disciple.com. Once again, www.justanother.disciple.com. Thanks again.